There's a new memo out, and USCIS is now encouraged and required in certain situations to actually refer someone to immigration court, issue them a notice to appear for deportation proceedings if USCIS denies their application. This applies to green cards, this applies to citizenship. So let's talk about what you can do to make sure that your application is tight, because now every single thing that you do is going to be scrutinized. Okay, they're going to be looking at every single application with so much detail and the magnifying glass. So let's make sure that you know what the perfect immigration application recipe looks like, so that when you are preparing your application or you're working with me, you know what to expect. All right. I am U.S. immigration attorney Lilian Chukwurah, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenships for themselves and their families using the U.S. immigration law system. When we're thinking about the application process, you really want to think about what is it that USCIS is going to be looking at, and what is it they're going to be looking for in your application in order to be able to approve it. So the first thing they're going to be looking at is that you have the forms, right? So that's number one. Number one is forms, okay? We want to make sure that you have the correct forms for your application. So if you are filing a green card application, your forms really matter. You want to make sure that you are including every single required form. Sometimes it may not seem obvious that a form is required. So let's take a marriage-based green card application, for example. You will need an I-130, an I-130A, which you will not find on the website unless you look under the forms associated with the I-130. Okay, so it's really important that we keep in mind that there may be additional forms required for a specific form that you're applying for. So an I-130 for a marriage-based case requires an I-130A. And then you go down. Now you need your green card application, which is the I-485. When you file a green card application based on marriage, you're going to need an affidavit of support, which is the I-864. Again, this is not obvious, right? Because when people think marriage-based applications, they're looking at what forms does it say? I-130, I-485. Those are the forms. But under those forms, there's additional forms that there's no fee for, right? There's no fee for an I-130A, but it has to be included. There's no fee for the I-864, the affidavit of support, but it has to be included with the I-485. So that is a place that people make a mistake in not including those additional forms because they don't think it's necessary or required. So with the new policy, we need to make sure that we are including every single form that's required for the application that we're filing. Now, if you're filing a green card application, regardless of the basis that you're filing that green card application, remember that now the medical exam is required. Before, you could send it in later when they send you a request for evidence. You can take it to the interview. That is no longer the case, right? So now, when you're filing your green card application, you have to include your medical exam in a sealed envelope. So that's part of the forms. You want to make sure that you're including the forms that are required for the application that you're filing. The second thing in this whole, recipe, once you know all the forms you need based on your particular situation, you're going to now look at the evidence you need to include for each of those forms. Okay? So that's the second thing, is the evidence, right? The evidence matters because without the evidence, the forms are just forms. Okay? The forms are just forms without evidence. So let's say you're filing a marriage-based green card application. If you do not include your marriage certificate, if you do not include evidence that you and your spouse live together or that you're building a life together, you just filed forms. Right? There's no way for an officer to actually properly evaluate your case if you didn't give them evidence that you're actually married to this person and that you're building a life together. If either of you have been married before and you do not include those divorce decrees, guess what? There's no way for the officer to know that those marriages, those prior marriages, legally ended. So that's why the evidence is so important. And your evidence is going to be based on the forms you're filing. So not every single form you file is going to require specific evidence, but you need to know that when you're filing an I-130, you need to prove the status of the petitioner. So is the petitioner a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident? Either way, you need to prove it, right? Is it based on marriage? Okay, where's the marriage certificate? If either of you have been married before, where are the divorce decrees or death certificates for those prior marriages? Okay, because you have to show that you were free to get married. This is not, USCIS is not going to do the research for you. Okay, remember, this is an application that you are filing. So they want the evidence. So you want to make sure that you're including that evidence. Like I said, most forms have required evidence that's needed. Typically for my clients, I give them a checklist and they just need to give me the stuff on the checklist. If you are doing this on your own, you need to make sure that you're reading the instructions for each form that you're filing, because each form may have its own evidence requirement. Sometimes they may overlap and you just need to provide that evidence once, but sometimes they don't overlap and you need to make sure that you're including evidence of that specific form. So, for example, when you're filing a green card application, you need an affidavit of support. That means you need information for at least 2 years of previous tax returns, and the most recent tax return has to be included in your filing. So you need to make sure that you have the proper documentation. You have those tax returns ready to go to file your affidavit of support with your green card application. Again, the green card application itself, right? Because there's certain green card applications that don't require an affidavit of support. So that green card application itself does not require you to include tax returns. But when you have to file an affidavit of support, that requires you to include the tax returns. So you need to make sure that each form that you're filing, you are including the evidence that's required for that specific form. The next thing is the interview. This is where things usually get interesting. Right? So this is where people kind of just drop the ball, honestly. So they may be on top of their forms, their evidence, all of that. But when it comes to the interview, for some reason, people drop the ball. They don't see it as a critical part of the process. Well, it is the most critical part of the process because this is the officer's only opportunity to talk to you and your spouse and physically fill you out and figure out what, if there's anything that's just blocking them about your relationship. Right? So this is your opportunity to make a lasting impression on this officer. And a lot of times people don't take it as seriously as I think they should. So for my clients, we do a mock interview. We do, as many mock interviews as it takes for them to feel comfortable. And in those mock interviews, I am the immigration officer. Right? I take the role as the officer. I am not your lawyer during that mock interview. I am going to push you. And by the end, people feel more comfortable and confident going into an interview. And when I do those mock interviews, I am treating it as if I'm the worst officer you will ever meet. Because when we get in there and the officer is nice and sweet and only asks you 5 questions, you will feel relieved. But what if I only did a 5-minute mock interview with you? And then we get in there and the officer is treating you like you two have been, enemies since you were born. What if that's the experience you get? Then you're like, you only freaking me for 5 minutes. What is this? What's going on? And you start freaking out. Wow. That's the whole point of the mock interview, especially in marriage-based green card applications. The interview is so important because it makes such a difference. Okay, I tell people all the time, that interview can make or break your case. Okay, the interview can make or break your case. So you really want to make sure that you are taking your time, making sure you and your spouse are on the same page. So the mock interview is not about, memorizing your answers or rehearsing your answers, but it is a way to make sure that you and your spouse are on the same page. Quick story. I had a couple that had an interview and came to me after the interview because the officer issued them a notice of intent to deny, saying that your marriage is not real. Like, there's no way. Guess what one of the issues were? First one, the floors. One spouse said it was wood. The other spouse said it was tile. And then for their bedroom, one spouse said the door was on the left, and the other spouse said the door was on the right. And the officer was like, well, there's no way you two live in the same house when you're giving me completely different answers to basic questions about your home. Well, they came to me and we figured out what the issue was. Guess what the issue was? The floors were tile, but they had a wood grain. So when you look at them and you don't know the difference, you would think they were wood. But because one spouse lived in that house when the floors were put in, they knew they were tile and not wood. While the other spouse moved in after and just saw the wood grain and assumed it was wood. And then for the bedroom, there's two doors to their bedroom, right? So depending on which door you're coming in, things are going to be on different walls, right? So if I'm coming in through the front door and the other spouse is coming in through the back door, obviously our orientation, the way we're seeing things in the room, and we're going to describe where things are in the room, are going to be different. And the officer, after we explained that with pictures, with statements, the officer was able to understand that it was just a misunderstanding and was able to approve the case. So when I say the interview matters. Like the officer did not mention, oh, you didn't present enough documentation. It was your interview made me believe that your marriage is not real. Because how could you live in the same house and have these different answers to the same question? So being prepared for the interview is so important. Like I said, it's not about rehearsing your answers. It's making sure that you and your spouse have the same understanding of things. When you are married to someone that's born outside of the US, their understanding, their measurement systems, all of those things can be different. The way they use certain words can be different. It does not mean that they're lying. It does not mean anything other than their understanding of certain things and your understanding of certain things are different. So you need to make sure that you two are on the same page before that interview. Because again, the interview matters so much. Okay? It matters so much. All right. So number 4 on this recipe is the follow up, right? It is the follow up. In that story I just told you, there was a follow-up that needed to happen, which is when the office sent a notice of intent to deny the case. Now the client had to figure out how do we respond to this and prove to the officer that our marriage is real. So that follow-up, you do not want to mess with it. When you have that interview and there's an issue at the interview and you're sent that notice, do not take it for granted. That is literally your last opportunity to let the officer know that your marriage is real, that your application should still be approved. That is it. So I find that people would have the interview go badly, right? Have issues at the interview. They get that notice and they still choose to go at it on their own, assuming that they understand what the officer is looking for. At the very minimum, when you get a notice of intent to deny, you need to have a consultation with an immigration lawyer. That is at the minimum, right? Most of the time, My recommendation is to work with an immigration lawyer to respond to the notice of intent to deny, not to follow up on your own. However, if that is not a possibility for you, at a minimum, get a consultation. See what the lawyer thinks of the notice of intent to deny. Do they have, recommendations of what documents you should include? That's why, again, the follow up matters. Without the follow up, without doing what you need to do, when they send you that notice of intent to deny and you do not respond, or you do not respond in a way that explains the inconsistencies or the issues that the officer has with your case, the officer is going to deny your case. And now, with that NTA memo going around, the officer can choose to put you in deportation proceedings. So, again, every single step on this matters, and you need to take each step seriously. All right? One thing I did miss on the forms. So there's the forms and there's the fees that goes with the forms. Let me even fix that. Plus fees. Okay? Number one, forms and fees. You need to make sure you include the right fees for the forms. Okay? So when you are dealing with USCIS, there's forms that have fees, and you need to know the right amount to pay. Because if you include the wrong fees, they're going to reject your application. All right? If you include the wrong forms or you don't fill out the forms completely and correctly, they're going to reject your application. So you need to make sure that you have the right forms, you're filling it out completely and correctly, and you are including the right fees. Then you need to make sure that you're including the evidence that's required for those forms. If it's a marriage-based case, you need to make sure that you're including as much evidence of your relationship as possible in this stage. Again, we cannot rely on you getting a request for evidence anymore. So you need to make sure that you're including as many evidence as possible. You cannot rely on your interview being waived anymore. So you need to be prepared for that interview. When you get the interview notice, make sure that you're doing a mock interview. My office, we're going to start offering mock interviews as a separate service that you can sign up for, and I would basically be the officer asking you questions about your marriage and your relationship, getting you ready for that interview. So that is one thing you need to know. That interview prep is important. The interview itself is important. All right. And then these follow-ups. If there is a notice of intent to deny for your case, you need to take it very, very seriously, because that is your last opportunity to show the officer that they are wrong and that they should still approve your case. If you miss that opportunity and the officer denies your case, yes, you can file an appeal for the I-130. 9 times out of 10, when you file that appeal, the appeals court is going to side with the officer. So you want to make sure that you are following this, that you are taking every single step seriously, so that you can present the best application possible for your situation. And that is my application recipe that I use for my clients, that I use for anyone that comes to me about their immigration case. We are going through this recipe, and we're making sure that at every single stage that we are presenting the best possible options and best possible documentation and preparation for our clients. So if, like I said before, if you are filing this on your own, make sure that at every single stage you are reading instructions. You are, making sure that you're including every single thing that you can to prove your relationship, to prove that you qualify for the green card. Now, for the interview, you need to prepare for that as well. Okay? Be prepared to answer questions about your relationship as deeply as possible. Okay? So, if you are in a situation where you're trying to, make sure that your recipe is tight, your application is following all of these, feel free to reach out to me. We can schedule a strategy session where I can see what your situation is and see if we can work together to make your green card dreams come true. Again, with my clients, we follow this recipe on every single case. So if you want to schedule that strategy session with me, you can go to my website, lillylegal.com, click on contact us, and you can pick a date and time that works best for you for us to chat.